Oh, greetings everybody. I wanted to do a video response to my good friend OG Jimbo and his recent video. I think it was called, Could Consciousness Have Risen Without Religion? Or could consciousness arise without religion? And I think that was it. He was posing it out there as well to, different planets in the universe and, whether or not it would be possible, because he was basically asking, is it just a natural product of contemplating one's own existence and place in the universe that we, develop these things. And I kind of think it is a natural product of it, but I don't necessarily think it would have to lead to religion. When I first came to the UK, I spent a lot of time traveling around as a hobby, looking at ancient sites. I've visited so many burials and hill forts and stone circles and standing stones. I've completely lost count. And one of the things that happens when you do that is it forces you to contemplate what it might have been like 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 centuries ago, when basically all these people had was the world around them, their natural world, and they knew they were a part of it. There was no doubt in their mind that they were animals, so they knew that they were animals. They knew they needed food like other animals did. They knew that they depended on something dying in order for them to live like other animals did. They knew that they would die like other animals did. So they associated themselves with the natural world around them. And it's really easy for me to sort of imagine, all this is pure conjecture, I recognize that, but it's really easy for me to imagine, the progression of understanding as consciousness grew into intelligence. And simple observations about the natural world. For example, this is one example of many that you could make, but flowers and leaves follow the sun across the sky. And that would be very easy to observe. These people had nothing to do but observe the world around them and try to survive in it. And in order to survive in it, you need to understand it. And in order to understand it, you have to observe it. And one of the things you're going to observe is everything depends on the sun. And the sun is up there. It's untouchable. And everything in the sky is untouchable. Whereas everything else in nature, you're a part of, and you can empathize with. But the sun is the great untouchable, and yet everything depends on it. It's really easy for me to understand that they would invest the sun with some kind of personification, give it some kind of personality, because that, I think, is the early concept. What we now call personality, in many respects, I think is what they used to think of as spirituality. I'm not the same person as my brother, although we have the same parents. And in the same sense that in the olden days, they might have made that kind of observation and then said, yes, and, an eagle is not a sparrow, and it's not a seagull or a raven, and yet they're all birds. So the difference between different beings was their spirit, and the difference between me and my brother would be our spirit. And the sun must have a spirit because it controlled everything. And from that, the idea of God is easy. So I really understand. It really makes sense to me how these notions of first spirituality, which, by the way, don't depend on a belief in the supernatural and don't depend on the notion of an immortal soul. I think both of those things come much later. I think spirituality can just be an empathizing with the natural world around you, realizing that you're a part of it and dependent on it. I think that is what spirituality really is. And this idea that there's something about me, that I have some kind of essential quality, just like everything else in nature seems to have its own distinct essential quality. I think that's where it comes from. I think it's only later, through religion, that they try to put on things like, an immortal soul, or that, that God is some kind of supernatural thing, that it's not the sun. The sun is what, they kept the personality of God, but took the entity away from the sun itself and made it this, invisible sort of concept kind of a thing. Which is really handy because then you can throw whatever garbage you want onto it and make it stick because nobody can prove you're wrong. I digress. My point basically, though, is I understand how it happened here. Now, do I think it had to happen that way? I understand how it happened that way, and it's difficult to imagine it happening a different way. But that could just be a lack of imagination on my part. For example, you change one thing about that, and it is easy to see how it could have happened a different way, and how it could therefore happen differently on other worlds. Because what if human beings were nocturnal? We wouldn't have been able to make all these associations about how everything depends on the sun, and therefore that there's not some overbearing, controlling exterior thing that we depend on that controls us, that we can't manipulate, whereas we can manipulate everything in the natural world to some degree. So I think it would be very easy to see how a different species, whether on this planet or another planet, could evolve without, with a sense of spirituality even, but without necessarily having a concept of a creator being or a controlling God. And therefore, religion might be kind of hard to force on people, because religion is an attempt to control people. Because I think spirituality, a sense of spirituality is, and you can make a strong argument for what I'm about to say, but I recognize going into it that it's not a persuasive argument. But I think that spirituality is a human inclination to some degree, in the same way that procreation is, in the same way that survival is by means of, eating and shelter. And I think that religion tries to control all of those things to some degree by controlling spirituality. Because through religion, through the attempt to control spirituality, I can't think of a major religion that doesn't have some kind of dietary restrictions. I can't think of a major religion which doesn't have some kind of strictures against who you can mate with, um, for example. And frankly, if you can control how people reproduce and if you can control what they eat, you control them, especially before the modern world existed. Those were the basic parts of human beings' existence. And if you can control them, you control the people. Simple as that. So I think that's where religion comes from. It's easy for me to imagine that a different species on another world, I don't think that the human psychological template would necessarily be one that is universal. So it's really easy for me to imagine that different beings would have developed differently. I mean, like, for example, what if they were nocturnal, or what if they were aquatic, or subterranean. There's any number of different ways that intelligent life could rise up from nature and evolve without necessarily depending on uh, the idea that there is some kind of creator or some kind of overarching controlling entity which manipulates all of reality. So I think that it is easy to imagine that religion doesn't necessarily have to develop. It's harder for me to imagine that spirituality on some level wouldn't develop, because as conscious, as you become aware of your natural world, all, no matter where in the cosmos it's going to be, all of nature is going to depend on, be interdependent upon other factors in the environment. And I think, you know, as consciousness develops, that interconnectedness would be pretty obvious to the earliest people who were forming thoughts and trying to figure out their place in the world.